bring up our slide where we left off yesterday. Okay. Okay. So where we left off yesterday is, if you recall, I was going through experiments and stuff that have been done on obedience. And before we move on to some more kind of real life examples about what we've been talking about, I do want to just emphasize that obedience, compliance, conformity, they both have a good part to them and a bad part to them. What most experiments have focused on, admittingly, if you've heard our lectures for the last couple of days, is kind of the negative side of things like obedience and compliance and those kinds of things. However, it is important to note that these variables, these social interactions, do have a positive influence as well on society if they're not misused like they've been in these experiments that we've talked about. Okay. For example, and I think I brought this up again and again, can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't all comply or obey um, driving rules? What if we all decided whether or not we were going to stop at a red light or a green light? What if we all decided that we could just go into a grocery store and take what groceries we want and just leave? Um, and maybe the best example of why these things do have a purpose, especially for social beings like humans, is the opposite of social control, which is anarchy. Okay. Complete anarchy is when there's no rules, no government, no regulation on anything, and it is just left up to basically the free will of individuals to survive. Okay. There was some experiments done where we use computer simulation. Okay. And in that computer simulation, we put all of the variables associated with anarchy, but also the systems we have today, even the bad systems like, for example, dictatorships and military coup type governments, but also positive ones like democracy and republics and those kinds of things. And what we do in these experiments is we do what's called a Monte Carlo process, where we literally run scenarios thousands and thousands of times, and we switch variables with different variables. So one will run with one variable and another one will run with another. And literally, the last one that was ran was so big that it took a week to run it, and it runs on automation. It's not a human controlling it. It ran for 1 week in a facility that had over 200 computers and was 2 stories high. And it took all of that processing power plus 7 days to really go through basically millions of scenarios about what would happen if we had total anarchy against all of these other social control systems that we have. And out of all of those millions of scenarios that the computers played over a week period of time, not one, there wasn't one where anarchy did not lead to the extermination or the extinction of human beings. Okay. And so I bring this up because when compliance and obedience and all of those have checks and balances, and we reduce things like human error and human prejudice and power, they do have they do have a positive effect on our survivalship. So I just wanted to bring that up because we're going to wrap up with some real life scenarios that really make you kind of question whether we are really thoughtful, cognitive beings or if we're just pressured to the situation that we exist in. And it is a combination of both, I hope you have seen so far. Okay, so let's go on. The first real life scenario has to do with the medical setting. Okay, and the medical setting is a good setting to start because you have a group of highly educated people um, that are trying to help the most helpless people we have, those who are ill and can't and sick and injured. Okay, and when we look at two individuals, the registered nurse and the medical doctor, they have an interesting relationship. Because if you've ever known anyone that has gone through RN school, it's not easy. They learn about medications, dosages. They have to take physics classes. They have to take human growth and develop. They take a lot of very difficult classes to become a knowledgeable RN. And you probably know medical doctors, they go through medical school and then they have to go through specialization and all those things. So I'm not discounting a medical degree, but what I'm saying is we have two very highly knowledgeable people. Okay. But hospitals have a hierarchy that is kind of fixed, that the medical doctor is kind of the commander in chief. And irregardless of the RN's knowledge, they are often belittled or argued with if they challenge the medical doctor's decision. So I'm going to run you. I guess this is more of an experiment than a real life thing, but it's kind of it happened in the real life setting. Is that some experimenters chose a hospital, and if you know anything about an emergency room, they have an ER doctor roster. It's the all the doctors that are able to practice in the emergency room. The other thing that should note is that before a medication can be delivered, it has to have that doctor's signature or approval for it to occur. Um, and so we have these two variables. So in this situation, what these experimenters did is they had a person bogusly call. They purposely gave a doctor's name that was not on the doctor's roster. And they kind of set up a kind of fake scenario where they had a patient and they had this medication. Okay. And I can't remember the name of the medication off the top of my head, but it basically, if you gave over this certain amount, let's say 20 milliliters, I don't know. If you gave more than 20 milliliters, it could cause death. Okay. We also know that this is something that is taught when a nurse is going through nursing school. Okay. And even on the bottle, we put extra big descriptions that don't give over this amount could cause death. Okay. So the fake doctor calls, says, "Hey, I'm Dr. Bob. I have a patient. I'm coming in to do a procedure with them. Um, can you go prep them? I'll be there in about 40 minutes. Can you go prep them with 30 milliliters of this medication?" Okay. Now, again, didn't have the doctor's signature. The doctor wasn't on the doctor's roster, and the nurse should have knowledge that that's an improper dose. So you would assume that based on the situation, that the nurse would probably go get the head doctor or someone and say this head nurse and say, I was just told this whatnot. But what exactly did happen in this situation? Well, 22 out of the 23 nurses administered the lethal dose, okay, from the doctor's order. Yet only a small percent said that they would if they were actually put in that situation. Okay. Now, in my mind, the thing that upsets me about this research is I think they should have talked a little bit more about the one nurse that didn't do it instead of focusing on the 22, because I want to know that person and what made them choose not to do it. But just a something that always annoyed me about this research is they didn't say much about the nurse that did not do it. But that's a side note. Okay. In other research, 47% of nurses reported giving improper medication doses via doctor's orders in the past. So even though a small percentage say they would do that in that situation, we know from surveys at least about 47% have done improper dosages of medication. Okay. Now, you did not learn this from me, but if you have an X in the ER that you really don't like, this is very helpful information. But you did not hear this from me. Just kidding, just a joke. But anyways, so we have this kind of authentic but ambiguous authority figure, because the hierarchy is not something that is written down in policy and procedure. It is something there that is assumed within the hospital setting. Okay. But what happens when we do have a clear authority line? Okay. One of the purposes of a first officer in an airplane, and they're told this, is that they are supposed to monitor and challenge captain's questions when things become ambiguous, things become not within procedure for flight rules and all of those kinds of things. But again, in this situation where there's this hierarchy, that there's the captain and the first captain, sometimes the first captain is hesitant to question the decisions of the pilot or the captain of the ship. Okay. And indeed, in about 27 airplane accident investigations, in 81% of them, the cases, the root cause of the crash was due to the first officer not properly monitoring and challenging the captain's decisions. So again, in this dealing with these hierarchy type of situations and obedience, even when there is clear job description, that's what you're supposed to do, sometimes due to the power hierarchy within the situation, we don't always engage in the questioning behaviors that we should, or decision making decisions as we should. This is kind of what we kind of call blind obedience. Okay. Another example, well, I'm not going to do that one. The other example, I think I have two more. No. I have three more life examples, and we're going to skip the research ones. There's actually a show on this. I can't remember if it's a Lifetime show or what, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was something called a strip search scam. Okay. This was done by one individual. It happened in 68 different situations in 32 different states. Okay. And what this individual would do is he would call a fast food place, and in a little while we'll describe the situation within fast food that can create this type of behavior. Okay. But what he knew is what he looked for is fast food places that had a young female, usually an assistant manager or a shift supervisor. Okay. And to do this scenario, let's call our assistant manager Anne. Okay. And the guy, it was impersonating an officer. Okay. And so he would call and he would ask for either the manager or someone there with some authority, and just say, hey, I'm officer, and he would give a fake name. And he said, I'm investigating a chain of thefts within your fast food restaurants. Okay. And I'm about 45 minutes away. Um, and I have strong evidence that Anne is someone who is stealing from your fast food restaurant. Okay. And would you be willing to take Anne to the back room until I get there? Okay. And so in this situation, and then as he said yes, and he would say, keep me on the line. And as he's going to go to Anne, he says, now from here on out, just not to give away what we're trying to do here, refer to me as sir, not officer. I'm a sir. Okay. And that's a key thing that he did for legal reasons that we'll talk about later. And so the coworker or manager would take Anne to the back room and um, uh, put the guy on a speakerphone, and he would say, "Okay, Anne, this is what we're doing. We think you are the one who is stealing from the fast food place. Now, if you're a young person and everything else, what are you going to do? You're probably going to protest and say, no, no, it's not me. It's not me. And if it's near the end of the shift and they want to go home, the perpetrator would say, "Well, would you mind if your manager patted you down?" And to decry any thing, most of the young women said, "Yes, go ahead, pat me down." And it could be a female or male manager. Okay. And so they would do an initial pat down with clothes, and the guy would say, did you find anything? No, no. And he goes, we just have such strong evidence. Would and would you mind? Would you, no, he would ask the manager to do this. Ask her to see if you could search her with her shirt off. Okay. Now, this is a progression. Remember Milgram's obedience studies. It always starts with 15 volts. So it would be the shirt, the belt buckle, the shoes, the pants, and you can see where the progression going. Now, in 68 of these cases, about a quarter of them actually resulted in a sexual assault. Okay. So let's talk about this, because this is an interesting thing. When doing interviews with the individuals who did these sexual assaults, none of them had a history of rape. None of them had criminal histories. None of them ever saw themselves engaging in that kind of behavior. I want to make that very clear. Reason why we have to state that is a lot of the quarters of these individuals, many of them were actually convicted of rape. Okay. And the other thing we have to say is the guy on the phone has never been convicted. There's been prosecutors who have tried and thought to, but in the end, he was a passive bystander and it was not the one who committed the behavior. You can suggest to someone to do something, but it's up to that individual if they choose to do it, according to the legal part of that. And also, in the end, he said, I wasn't impersonating an officer. He said, I'm a sir. Stop calling me officer. Okay, you remember that language in the beginning. But anyways, so the question is what would lead people to do these behaviors? Well, let's go back to Milgram's 15 volts each time, an authority figure. Also, in a fast food place, the idea is that you do things methodological. You do the same thing in order. Okay. to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And so in that setting, it's easy to go through the recommendations of someone because that's basically your job. You follow a recipe, you build it, you take it, and you put it out. Also, not many people want to be stuck after work at a fast food restaurant. Not many, there's a few. And so that immediacy to want to get through that situation so that they could go home also contributed to the part on the assistant manager. Okay. Now, why a young female assistant manager? You could probably guess the female part of it, but the young assistant manager is also trying to prove themselves for potential higher positions, such as being a manager of their own store or a shift supervisor wanting to go to be assistant manager and then to a manager. So there's that want and desire within individuals in the management system to try and prove that they're worthy of going to that next level within the organization or within the restaurant. Okay. So we can be led to do really awful things. And this really actually reminds me of when I worked with female rapists. When I did a contract for a couple of years with a women's prison, and I was contracted to work with basically the worst of the worst. These were the rapists, the murderers, the people who did really awful things to people. Um, and I was hired because they had a huge suicide attempt rate, especially among this population. So, and I won't get into that part of the story, but I do want to express, for example, a lot of the rapists, how did they end up getting into that position? How did they end up becoming rapists? And I remember one individual um, is one, it always starts with a male antagonist. Okay. And I remember the one that I really worked with, she provided a very detailed history. Is yes, she was a meth addict and she couldn't afford her methamphetamine. So, and again, think about milligrams 15 volts. Okay. So she went to the dealer and said, hey, I can't afford it. So she had at the time the little girl was 8 years old. It was her daughter. And he asked for just a picture of her and he gave her a hit. And then he asked for a picture of her without her shirt off. And then, of course, you can see where that went. And then eventually he asked her to bring her daughter with her. And then he started engaging in behaviors with her. And then he said, for your next hit, you need to be involved with us. And then eventually he said, you need to be independent with her. And eventually, what that led to, that progression into those behaviors, is the individual ended up going and abusing not only her daughter, but her daughter's friends, independent of the drug use and the dealer. Okay. And that was the most common story I heard for females who are labeled as rapists and sexual abusers. Is it always started with an antagonist? Uh, uh, in my experience, it's 100%. I've talked to some of my colleagues. It's probably around 95%. It always starts with a male antagonist that then does that slow grooming procedure. And then eventually, at some point, the individual then goes and does those behaviors on their own. Okay. So, this is an example, some real life examples of how we can often engage in behaviors that we could never imagine ourselves engaging ourselves in, or even having the constitution of even being able to engage in those behaviors. Okay. Let's see. This one is kind of an interesting one. This was done in Palo Alto, California, with a high school history class. Um, and he could not, the teacher could not get, he asked his class, do you think Nazi Germany could happen here in the United States? And they said, absolutely not. It could never happen. Okay. And so he decided he was going to do his own kind of simulation. And what he did in this class is in the next class, he said, you know what, you guys, I need to be honest with you. This is you. You weren't just randomly selected to be in this history class. You were selected because all of you um, have a superior intellect, a superior mind to all of your other peers. And this class is is just specially designed for you to challenge your mind because you're going to go on and probably be our future leaders, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And it was interesting because what happened is over the length of that semester, they did kind of create a Hitler Nazi Germany in this high school. In that they started to wear red bands to show that they were part of this special group. They created their own Gestapo who would bully individuals who wanted to try and make friends with them. They started bullying the other people in the school. They started making it so that their group was separate from everyone else and no one could be in. They started to really, in the end, before the teacher said, okay, I got to put an end to this, they really started to show a abusive behavior towards those who were in more of the special education lower class, not lower social class, but lower kind of the classes where students need extra help. Okay. In the end, what he ended up doing was saying, okay, your leader, your supreme leader is going to be here tomorrow. And it's kind of an interesting story. I don't know if this is myth or legend or truth, but the myth, legend, or maybe truth is he brought him to the gym and he said, I'm going to turn on your leader. And what came on the TV was Hitler giving one of his speeches. Okay. And he said, you guys, there is nothing special about this class. You are incredibly special students, but this was all a simulation to show you that, yes, we can create a Nazi Germany in the United States. Okay. There's actually, I think it's a 1980s or 19 after school special on this. I can't remember if you want to look it up. I don't even know if you can see those anymore. I don't even know if you guys know what after school specials are. But anyways, but in the end, I do have to say, while we use this as an example, that teacher was fired and he was sued, especially by the other students who were bullied by their parents. So that didn't end up so good for him. But probably a real life example of that simulation is what happened with the German Battalion 101 and elderly family men. Okay. Because what happened is that there was a place in Germany that is surrounded by mountains. And during World War II, it was such an isolated place that they really didn't pay attention to what was going on. And so they were living their life day by day with their Jewish neighbors and whatnot. And because of this kind of isolated place, most of the town tended to be elderly, older family units. Okay. But one time near kind of the end of the war, where the German army was looking for recruits, looking for young men to join the army, they went to this place and they saw that Jews were still living in their home, that they were still peacefully having work, they were still owning their businesses. And so they went to the German battalion, went to these German men and said, are you German? Do you know what we're trying to do in this world? Okay. And just based on that German identity and the fact that these authority figures were telling them they were doing wrong, they went and shot 38,000 of their neighbor and deported them and deported 45,000. These were elderly men, not not uh, army trained individuals that did this. And it was about 90% of them just blindly did that just by the orders and the questioning of their Germanness and whether they're really German. Okay. So this is a kind of an example, a more extreme example of what we've been talking about with the Palo Alto example. Okay. I told you today was going to be dark. I hope you guys don't mind. The last example I think we use, and then we'll get on to something a little bit more lighthearted, is suicide bombers. Something that has always been questioned. Are suicide bombers uh, um, mindless fanatics that just join after they were threatened, or do they feel that they're mindful martyrs? Okay. Answer this question. Um, there's some reviews. 100 a suicide bomb. Suicide bombers. They were in the process of doing it. And the question is why did they do it? Were they mindful or were they mindless? Well, this is kind of some of the results. Okay, out of these 400 people, 75% were middle to upper middle class. 90% had caring, intact families. 2/3 had gone to college. 2/3 were married. Most had children. And the majority of jobs were science and engineering that they had. Okay. So if you think about just the demographics of the majority of these individuals, we need to kind of go with the mindful martyrs that they were making the decision to go into these actions, not with the threat of something or because they became mindless fanatics, but there was something else that was driving them to do this. Okay. And Joyner, who was kind of spearheading this research, found that there were two very common variables that was associated with all 400. Was it 400 or 200? 400, I think. I got to check again. I don't want to be misquoted. 400 Al Qaeda individuals. Okay. The first one was conformity and social power. They had a strong need to belong and connect to others. Okay. And that need for conforming and having a source of social belonging was an important aspect to these individuals. The second thing is they wanted to feel effective with or to influence others. Okay. Many in some of the narratives that these individuals gave, they said they didn't want to, for example, leave this earth and their family think they didn't do something to try and help and make their world better. They didn't want others to think that they were just people existing. They wanted to feel worthful. They wanted to feel like they could influence and make their family proud of them and make their community proud of them for doing something to help change the world or change the circumstances that they were living in. Okay. So again, I just want to talk about why we're going down this progression. A lot of times when we look at people who do awful, evil things, it is tempting to think that they're mentally ill, that there's something wrong with them. that they're sick in some way. Okay. And while I won't disagree that many of them probably do have some mental health issues, not mental illness, um, many are just like you and me, but they were put in a situation that demanded of them behaviors that if they were never put in that situation, they probably would have never done. Okay. And if we have time in this class, we'll talk about things like mass shootings and homicide and those kinds of things, if we have time to kind of really narrow this kind of thing down, because as after all, homicide and those are kind of one of the most open evilness that a person can do to another person. Okay, so let's talk. Does anybody have any questions about the obedience stuff that we've talked about before we go on to compliance? You can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Dina, you have your hand up.
It's not a question, but the you said it was a show, but it's actually a book. It's called The Wave, about the teachers who did the Nazi thing in their classroom.
I'm sorry, Dina. I'm having a really hard time hearing you. Can you repeat that?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, that's better.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hello?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Um, oh, the Nazi thing with the teacher, there's a book called The Wave.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it basically tells the same story.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. So there's a book there, so you don't have to go look for an old school after school special. Thank you, Dina, for mentioning that. I should also say, so, some other research that I didn't mention beyond the Palo Alto thing is there has been experiments with children about these kinds of issues. So, for example, in some school settings, teachers have told that the blue-eyed children are superior and more intelligent than the brown-eyed children. Okay, and believe it or not, the lowest performing blue-eyed child actually started to perform very well in the class. But they also started to discriminate and be prejudiced against the brown-eyed children. Okay. And in that same scenario, the teacher would actually come in and go, oh, no, 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 wait, wait, wait. I got it backwards. It's my brown-eyed children that are the more intelligent one. Now you would think, and I just want to bring this up. We haven't talked about prejudice and discrimination right now. This is usually when this comes up. You would think because the brown-eyed children were the recipients of prejudice and discrimination, that they would look at that and go, but the way they treated us when they thought that we really shouldn't treat them that way. No, the brown-eyed children became as discriminatory and prejudiced and biased towards the blue-eyed children as the blue-eyed children were to them. So I'm putting that there because I think we'll get to prejudice and discrimination, but that has more to do with that. So kind of keep that in mind as another school example of ways that we kind of um, simulate these kind of issues. So, okay. Dina, thank you for bringing up that book. That was excellent. Thank you. Okay, no other questions. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is compliance, and this is acting in accordance with a direct request of another person or a group. Now, with compliance, there's no power difference. Okay, it is a salesperson coming to sell you a car. It's someone from the school PTA asking you to bring cupcakes. It's your turn to bring the Gatorade to the soccer game or something like that. Okay. Um, and so compliance, though, has there's some interesting ways to look at compliance. And the reason why I like talking about these is so that you don't get stuck with scrupulous people just trying to get something from you. Okay. And so I want to go over some techniques that really, if you've been in a sales force, you probably have seen these before. Um, if you've definitely ever been a car salesman, or even if you've done with real estate, these techniques should look very familiar to you. Okay. But the first way to gain compliance is what's called the foot in the door technique. Okay. And this is when compliance to a large request is gained by preceding it with a very small request. Okay. So, so in this case, the research that really showed this was some researchers went and they did a drive safely campaign. Okay. And what they did is they initially went to some houses and they asked if they could put this giant sign on their lawn. And the majority of people said no because they were big signs. Okay. But then with some other houses, the first week they went and asked if they could just put this little sticker on their house or this little sign that you could put in your window. And the majority of people said absolutely yes. Okay. And then the next week or two, they would come back and say, hey, I noticed you put our little sign in the door. Would you consider putting this larger sign in your yard? And in that case, the majority of individuals were willing to put the larger sign because earlier they were like, wow, I already was committed to this one, so I could commit to something more. Okay. Um, I give this a lot of times with organizations I donate with. I know that one of my favorites is oh, what is it? Not Shriners. Medical. I like. I can't remember. St. Jude's. And I know that St. Jude's is going to call every 2 months. Okay. And they're going to say something like this. They're going to say, Mr. Peterson, I noticed that you're donating $50 right now. And that is wonderful. We have such a high need and everything. Would you consider doing $5 or $10 more? Okay. And that has been very effective for them. Okay. But that's the idea is you start with a small request and then you go with, and then later on you go with a more and more and higher kind of request. Okay. And that's called the foot in the door. All right. This is if you think about this in the car setting, this is um, uh, giving the person the basic vehicle, letting them drive around in the basic vehicle, and then they say, "Why don't you go ahead and take a test drive in the next higher up one?" Because they come back and they say, yeah, I think this will work. This is a good car. And they go, well, why don't you just go ahead and take a ride in the LX instead of the SX car? And so that's kind of how it kind of works in car settings as an example. Okay. The next one is a door in the face techniques. This is compliance and is gained by starting with a large, very unreasonable request that you know is going to be turned down, and then follow it with a smaller, more reasonable request. Okay. So again, I did this with a class once, and I asked the class for those who want to maybe eat out tonight or want to have food delivered or whatnot, try this. So let's say you want pizza. Okay. Go home and ask your roommate or your partner, hey, I would really love a T-bone steak with a nice fully loaded baked potato. That just sounds delicious. let's say this is Monday night, so it's not even date night, or you know that your roommate is as poor as you are. Uh, 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 and so most of the time they're going to say absolutely not, right? They're going to say, oh no, that's ridiculous. We can't afford that, da 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 da. So you kind of go, okay, well, how about a pizza? Okay. I will say that even if you can't afford the pizza, you'll most likely end up with having pizza that night. Okay. When I did it in my class, the success rate was right around 75%. Okay. Um, and so now don't do this scrupulously, but this is kind of that example. Okay. So it's again, when we go to the car dealer, they show you the premium vehicle that you know you can't afford, you know you can't have. And so then you ask, well, do you have anything more reasonable? And they go, absolutely. Let's go take a look at this. This is the real estate agent who starts with let's say you want a house for $250,000, but they start with the house that is $750,000. Okay. And so these are kind of techniques that can be commonly used in order to get compliance to different things. Okay. Other techniques is the low ball techniques. Okay. And this is where you get compliance to a costly request is gained by first getting compliance to an attractive, less costly request, but is re-engaged as on it. So this is kind of that introductory offer that we see on TV. Lowballing is when you get something that you really, really want, and then they say, well, we can add this for just a few dollars more. Okay. So this is kind of that app building thing. All right. This is a lot of phone video game things that do the in-app purchase stuff. So they give you that attractive game for free, but then they're like, well, hey, if you pay $4.99, we'll give you all of these points and all of these things and all this fake money. And that's how people kind of get rolling and make money off of those quote unquote free games. Okay. And the last one that we'll talk about is that's not all technique. Sorry about that. That's not all techniques. This is compliance is planned with a secondary request with additional benefits gained by presenting the request before the response can be made to the first request. So this is when you are looking at something, okay, and you haven't said yes or no, okay, and the salesperson looks at you and he goes, you know what, but just for today, I can add this in for just an extra few bucks and it will make the product even better, something like that. Okay. So in the low ball technique, you've already said, yes, hey, I want that. And then afterwards, they kind of add things on. In the that's not all technique, it's when the salesperson knows that you like the product, but you haven't committed to it, yes or no. So they add something into it or they provide an additional benefit. Okay. Um, and so these are all kind of sales techniques that have been studied that have been shown to increase compliance to some request that an individual gives. Okay. All right. We're going to skip these. You know what? I think we'll stop here for today and we'll finish this tomorrow because I don't think we're going to have enough time to get through it all today. And then we will really get into the personality section. But I just don't feel comfortable kind of going through those disjointed